Hi, how are you? Today we will travel to a time as cold as it is lonely. Let's talk about Napoleon and the cold, how winter defeated an army of 600,000 men. Now if you can, turn off the lights, settle down between warm blankets, and let your breathing slow down, because this is one of those stories where the ice speaks louder than any general. If you enjoy this kind of weird time travel, feel free to like, subscribe, but only if you really want to. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening to? And what time is it there? Now close your eyes, or let them weigh slowly, and come with me. We go to sleep learning. Have you ever imagined trying to conquer a place so vast and icy that it felt more like a frozen eternity than a land to be dominated? This is what Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who wanted to dominate the world, had in mind when he invaded Russia in 1812. His idea was simple: to crush the Russian Empire quickly and then march to other European countries. However, there was one small detail that he had not considered. Russia was not just a big country. It was huge. What about the Russian winter? Well, he was the last thing any man could control. Napoleon, in his reputation as a military genius, believed that Russia would give in with the strength of his great army, an empire of 600,000 men. After all, he had already crushed so many European powers in his trajectory. The cold should be just a detail to be overcome. The adverse conditions seemed to always be in his favor, to what would prove to be the greatest adversary of all, nature. Because, in Russia, winter was not just an obstacle, he was a weapon. And this weapon had no mercy. Imagine yourself as a Russian soldier, not unlike the others who marched alongside Napoleon. The sound of boots hitting the snow was deafening. With each step, the cold air cut through the skin. And although the great French emperor brought an immense army, nature was hand in hand with the Russians. They knew the vagaries of winter. They knew where to hide from the snow, where to eat something warm, and how to protect themselves from the cold. For Napoleon, it was uncharted territory, terrain that he could not master with his brilliant tactics. When you start imagining it, it's clear that this wasn't just a war against an army, but a war against something much older and more ruthless: the weather itself. And this winter, my friend, was not to be trifled with. 600,000 men. Have you ever stopped to think about the number of people this represents? Imagine a queue so long that you can't see the beginning or the end. That was the size of Napoleon's army, and that number was not a simple statistic. It was the firepower, the willpower, the promise of a great empire like Napoleon himself. What he didn't know was that as much as he had recruited an immense army, the cold, the terrain, and even the human wear and tear itself would cause this great force to be completely dismantled in a battle that would not even begin. When you hear of great armies of history, such as Napoleon's, you immediately think of a well-oiled machine, an unstoppable force that sweeps away everything in its path. But the truth is much more mundane and much more complicated. To move an army of this size, you need food, supplies, equipment, transportation, and logistics that would make even the most experienced general question whether it is worth it. Imagine the size of the food trucks and the thousands of wheels of munitions carts moving across endless lands, while the cold tore the flesh and froze the souls of men. It was not just about fighting human enemies. Winter itself was setting a trap. Each man in Napoleon's army carried a weight that could not be shared because the cold also weighs. It wasn't just the heavy cannons or the backpacks full of equipment. The real burden was the very expectation of victory, a weight that dragged with each uncertain step. At that moment, the grandeur of the army was no longer an advantage. It was a curse. And the farther Napoleon advanced, the more he realized that his army began to look like an open wound, which only grew without being able to be stopped. The warmth was lost at every step, and what was once an imposing army slowly turned into a band of malnourished, demoralized, and above all frozen. Food, which was the link between survival and death, was no longer enough to fuel Napoleon's ambition. But how could he know that the size of the army would be his downfall? After all, size is never a document, especially when it comes to warfare in sub-zero temperatures. When you think of an army marching to war, you imagine soldiers with their swords, bright uniforms, and of course an indomitable spirit. But Napoleon and his men were about to face something far more lethal than any human enemy: the Russian cold. Now imagine the scenario: 600,000 men marching into nothingness, an army that, in theory, was unbeatable, but that barely knew what it was about to face. In those moments, preparing for the cold revealed itself not as an item of equipment, but as a slow and relentless death sentence. Napoleon did not underestimate Russia, but for all his strategic genius, he could not foresee the impact of a real Russian winter. Soldiers were told to prepare for the cold, but this meant little more than being given a few skins and cloaks to protect themselves. The expectation that they could take Russia quickly, without winter being a major obstacle, was an illusion that Napoleon nurtured. But anyone who has seen a Russian winter up close knows that fur clothes and capes can even help for a while. But the real cold goes beyond clothes. It's almost like when you try to warm up in a cold house without a good heater. In the beginning, you can still fool yourself into thinking that everything is fine, that the heat will arrive. But soon, even the best clothes can't protect your bones from the chill that penetrates the skin. At first, the soldiers were confident, as if they were only in a temporary challenge. But as the temperatures dropped and the winds cut mercilessly, that confidence turned into a freezing nightmare. Napoleon's men began to suffer from the conditions of the terrain, the soft snow, the merciless wind, and of course the humidity that rendered the body practically useless. There were no modern heaters, and those armies did not have the luxury of appropriate clothing for the occasion. They did not know how it would degrade their physical and moral strength. What was expected to be a grandiose victory was about to become an irreparable disaster, and all because of the weather that, being so immense, not even Napoleon could control. How can an entire army be caught off guard by something as basic as winter? The answer is simple if cruel: human arrogance. Napoleon's empire had conquered so many lands, but the Russian cold did not bow to the grandeur of his deeds. And as the cold intensified, reality imposed itself. It wasn't just a supply problem. It wasn't a question of strategy. It was nature, in its purest form, that took over. In a war, one of the biggest challenges is making sure soldiers have the basics: food. But on an expedition like Napoleon's to Russia, the basics turn into luxury. At first, his men's diet was rationed, with minimal portions for each soldier, and this rationing only worsened as the days passed. The smell of food that didn't come, or food that was overdue, was one of the greatest trials they faced. Imagine yourself walking through the icy field, your stomach empty, with the only food you can get being the meager ration that can barely sustain a hungry body. The ration consisted of hard breads, salad meat that was already dried, and some kind of soup that could barely warm the body but did nothing inside. Can you imagine the smell of salted meat, rotting, mixed with the stench of tired and exhausted bodies, breathing the same smoke from the fires where they tried to warm the frozen bones? It was as if the food itself was a constant reminder of how survival was a daily struggle. Now think about how different it would have been if they had been somewhere warmer, where at least their stomachs could be warmed with something nutritious. But here, food was rationed to try to keep the troops moving. And with each day without enough food, men's morale dropped as fast as the temperature. The long marches across the frozen terrain further increased physical exhaustion, and the result was inevitable. The army weakened both inside and out. The food that was supposed to be the bedrock of a fight continued to be a reminder of how far they were from the safety of home. And then there were the odors, which became part of everyday life. The smell of blood, sweat, and decomposing bodies was not something that could simply be ignored. The smell of death hung in the air, mixed with hopelessness. The heat of the fires, even when in abundance, was ineffective in warming the body as they needed. It was not just a matter of hunger, but of a deep tiredness that spread like a mist. Despair seeped into every man's minds, along with the unmistakable smell of a decaying army. And the worst thing was that as Napoleon's troops advanced, food sources became increasingly scarce. There were no fertile fields in which to grow food, and meat that could be hunted became harder to find. When rationed food became a rare luxury, soldiers began to suffer even more. For many, the real despair was not only in hunger, but in the realization that they were being consumed by their own survival. The smell of rotting food, the lack of fresh food, and the constant feeling of emptiness in the stomach became constant companions for all who were marching to their deaths, not yet knowing how close it was. Have you ever felt a chill that seems to run through your soul? Something so unforgiving that it doesn't matter how many coats you wear or how hot the surrounding environment is. The cold, it simply refuses to be ignored. Now, imagine the experience of a soldier marching into the heart of Russia in the winter of 1812. The sharp air, the fine snow, and the feeling that the cold will devour you inside. On the battlefield, cold was not just a weather condition. He was an invisible but deadly enemy who was more present than any Russian soldier or French general. For Napoleon's men, the feeling of cold was a sensory nightmare. The pain in her frozen hands and feet was so acute that it felt like constant torture. The fingers, once agile and strong, were now numb, unable to properly hold the weapon. The extremities of the body seemed to be the first to succumb, but the cold did not stop there. It penetrated deeper, reaching the bones, the muscles, the lungs. It was a dull pain, which spread through the body like a shadow. Over time, the feeling of hot was a distant memory, and the only relief came when death, silent and icy, finally came. And then there was the wind. Those relentless blasts that cut through the uniforms and infiltrated even the pores of the skin. The sound of the wind was the only constant companion during the long, endless marches. It hissed through the trees, howled through the Russian steppes, and in moments of silence it sounded like a distant scream. Every step taken in the snow was a reminder that the enemy was not just the Russian army, it was also the environment itself. Napoleon, who had already faced so many challenges in his campaigns, found himself powerless in the face of the fury of winter. Nothing could prepare a man to face the loneliness that the cold imposed. And the soldiers, who were already pure fatigue, now faced something even more cruel, the feeling that no matter how hard they fought, the cold would win. The Russian winter was not just a physical obstacle, he destroyed the spirit. The long nights in which the army took shelter, barely able to rest, were marked by the constant struggle against sleep, hunger, and above all, cold. There was no room for human warmth nor for comfort. Death drew closer with each step, but the cold was what gave him his hand, leading each soldier to the end, unhurriedly. Time seemed frozen. The sky, which had once been a ceiling of infinite possibilities, now looked like an icy abyss that threatened to swallow everything. What was most impressive was how quickly the human body gave in to these extreme conditions. The cold, more than any bullet or sword, caused a slow but inevitable death. For Napoleon's men, the army was not just a body of soldiers. He was becoming a great mass of frozen flesh and bones, each fighting his own battle against an unseen enemy. And Napoleon, brilliant as he was, seemed increasingly distant from the answer to this question of survival. Nature, in the end, seemed to be the only winner. If the cold wasn't enough, the combination of hunger, exhaustion, and poor hygiene conditions created the perfect scenario for disease. And the worst thing is that these diseases did not announce themselves with the crack of a drum or with a warning flag. They arrived silently, treacherously, like invisible ghosts that devoured the strength of men without anyone even knowing exactly where they came from. Imagine a soldier, already tired, with his feet frozen, his meat cold, and then he begins to feel unwell. He thinks it's just tiredness, but it's not. What he doesn't know is that he's starting to be consumed by something even more relentless than winter, a fever that doesn't let up. Diseases spread like a shadow among the troops. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses related to cold, poor hygiene, and contaminated water were devastating. The spread of disease became so rapid that many soldiers barely had time to realize they were sick before they fell, feverish and delirious. And in the midst of this, a grim reality. The army doctors, as well as the soldiers, were equally unprepared for what was happening. Diseases were like the icy wind, invisible but utterly devastating, and no one could escape them. And who can forget typhus, which seemed specially adapted for this kind of scenario? The disease spread rapidly among men, caused by lice, excrement, and poor hygiene. Imagine the army barracks, poorly built, overcrowded, with a mixture of exhausted, numb, and feverish bodies. The air was impregnated with the smell of sweat, of bodies that could no longer wash themselves, of clothes that did not dry. Each night the fever of some increased and souls were taken away without warning. For many soldiers, the army was no longer a military force. It was an incubator of diseases. In addition, there was dysentery, that terrible abdominal pain that spared no one. In the cold, the soldiers could barely stand, and the dirty waters became their only sources of hydration. With food scarce and health conditions degraded, the risk of contamination was imminent. Each sip of dirty water was an invitation to the silent death that was approaching. The army, once a war machine, was slowly turning into a heap of sick, frozen bodies, with its soldiers fighting no longer against the Russians but against nature itself. And, of course, death did not come like a swift arrow. No, It slowly approached, taking over the bodies, weakening the minds. When Napoleon's men fell, it wasn't always a matter of war or direct combat. It was the disease that infiltrated like a parasite, robbing all that was left of the will to live. Each man knew that when he woke up in the morning, he could find someone by his side who couldn't resist. Death, then, no longer became an isolated event, but part of the daily life of war. And with each death, Napoleon's army weakened even more, not only physically, but spiritually. Now, imagine the contrast with our modern reality. Today, we have vaccines, medicines, and a more advanced health infrastructure. Death caused by disease in the context of Napoleon's troops was a tragedy that could have been avoided if medical care had been more effective. But in that scenario, the diseases were like winter itself, an invisible, unbeatable, and immensely lethal enemy. At the beginning of the campaign in Russia, Napoleon and his generals probably held out hope that the immense army could maintain discipline, with all soldiers behaving in an exemplary manner. The idea of a strong, united army, marching in order, followed the military ideal that had sustained so many victories in the past. But as the Russian winter imposed its rigors and the difficulties of survival began to erode morale, discipline began to disintegrate, like a house of cards exposed to a strong wind. The rigidity of hierarchy and zeal for order, which had previously been the backbone of the Napoleonic army, gave way to chaos. The cold not only affected the soldiers' bodies but undermined their wills. What could have been a well-trained and focused army slowly turned into a mass of disorganized men, each more concerned with survival than carrying out orders. Imagine Napoleon's soldiers marching in, each fighting against his own body. If at least one of them had been closely observed, it would have been possible to see how much despair and panic were already taking over their minds. In the beginning, there were still those who followed orders without question. But over time, the food that didn't arrive, the cold that seemed more unbearable by the hour, and the deaths that happened around them without explanation, the orders began to sound hollow and unrealistic. The soldiers, once disciplined, began to abandon their positions, to disperse, to seek some refuge to escape from that endless torture. It didn't take long for the number of deserters to increase dramatically. Panic spread like wildfire in a dry field. Who could still believe that they could be saved from such a catastrophe? When food disappeared and death loomed at every turn, loyalty and duty seemed laughable. Survival became the only priority, and to do so, men began to move away from the ranks, seeking shelter and safety, even if it was in the arms of the winter that would slowly devour them. But Napoleon still believed in his ability to reverse the situation, trying to maintain the morale of the army, trying to maintain discipline, as if it were possible to restore what was already broken. He probably saw his great force, an army of 600,000 men, as something that could still be saved. But the truth was that the disruption of discipline had occurred irreversibly. The army was no longer a cohesive unit. It was a lost crowd, with each man dealing with pain, cold, and hopelessness in a lonely way. The order of the battlefield was as fragile as the promise of victory, and with each man who defected, Napoleon's strength thinned more and more. There were no more soldiers loyal to the cause. There were survivors trying to escape the death that inevitably approached. The army was fragmenting, and discipline, which had once been the bedrock of Napoleon's power, was no more than a distant memory. All that was left now was the fight for survival, and discipline could no longer be a priority over what really mattered: life. As the days passed and Napoleon's march dragged through the desolate landscape of Russia, the morale of the army shattered like an old, worn-out cloak. The morale of a troop is not something that can be measured solely by its ability to fight or to follow orders. It is something deeper. It is trust, faith in your leader, the certainty that victory is within reach. But when fear creeps in and weariness overcomes any vestige of hope, morale disappears. And this happened quickly with Napoleon's army. Fear, like a growing shadow, began to erode the soldiers' confidence. Imagine if you could feel the tension in the air as you marched, each step heavier than the last, each morning harder to cope with. The fear of not surviving the next night, the fear of being the next to fall due to cold, hunger, or even worse, disease. The fear that no matter how hard they fought, fate was already sealed. And this fear was not only limited to the soldiers, but also to the officers who were beginning to realize that the battle against the natural elements was beyond any military strategy. Napoleon, as the leader of a grandiose empire with an unbeatable army, had relied on his ability to keep the morale of his soldiers intact. But the harsh reality was that he was dealing with an enemy that could not be defeated with tactics or maneuvers. The Russian winter had no mercy. Cold, disease, and scarcity of food were invisible forces that destroyed the will of men, and this destruction could not be combated by fiery speeches or by orders to advance. Moreover, the contrast between the grandeur of Napoleon's empire and the cold, arid reality his soldiers were living in only added to the sense of hopelessness. Every step taken in the snow seemed to be a cruel reminder of how Napoleon's empire was crumbling. The army that had once marched proudly now moved forward with hunched shoulders, empty eyes, each day closer to completely disintegrating. What Napoleon did not understand was that, however much it was possible to maintain a certain order on the battlefield, the morale of the troops could not be commanded as a regiment. It was built over time, sustained by the faith that, with effort, victory would be achieved. But as death took hold of so many and snow covered the fallen bodies, fear became the only commander. Fear and hopelessness corroded everything. Desperation not only caused a drop in morale but also impeded any strategic breakthrough. Napoleon's men, once an imposing force, began to see their mission with different eyes. It was no longer an achievement. It was no longer a military glory. It was just a fight for survival. Napoleon's empire, with its grandeur, became a joke in the face of the cruelty of winter. In the end, the morale of Napoleon's army was not only destroyed by nature, but also by the immense hopelessness of an army that felt there was no reason to fight anymore. What began as a march in search of glory ended up being a race for life, with each man more aware of cold, hunger, and death than of honor or victory. As the Russian winter deepened and Napoleon's forces began to disintegrate, what was left of the 600,000-strong army was forced to make an inevitable decision: to withdraw. But this was not a strategic retreat as history often romanticizes, but a desperate escape from death. The march that had begun as an imposing invasion quickly turned into an endless nightmare. There was no longer a victorious army marching into Russia, but a jumble of survivors trying to escape the frozen hell. And you may wonder, how does such an immense army get lost in this way? The answer is not simple. It was not just a question of military defeat. It was a matter of survival. As the days passed, the disorganization intensified. The army, already torn apart by cold and disease, no longer marched with the precision of a war machine. Instead, the soldiers dragged on without strength, without courage, each step more arduous than the last, until at last the retreat was ordered. It was not a planned retreat, nor an honorable retreat. It was an escape. The word collapse best describes what was happening. Every soldier struggled with exhaustion, with cold, with the fear of being left behind. The line between the living and the dead became increasingly blurred. Many, unable to keep pace, fell and were abandoned, both by their troops and by nature itself. The tragedy of such an escape lies not only in the death toll, but in the way hope has been completely dilapidated. Imagine the scenario: men who once marched proudly, now trudging through the snow, eyes empty, desperately seeking any sign of relief. The sound of the biting wind, the howling of the storm, the crackling of the snow under his feet, all these sounds merged with the whispers of despair. What was left of the army was picking up what it could: a few rounds of ammunition, tattered clothes, bodies that couldn't take it anymore. There was no more honor in the ranks. There was no more courage to conquer land. There was only the basic impulse to escape the end. Napoleon, aware of the impending collapse, tried to maintain control. But what was happening was something that could not be controlled with a simple order or strategy. When the retreat began, despair took hold of everyone. There was no more organization, no planning. It was a disorderly race for survival, and that in itself was a fatal blow to the pride of an army that months before was considered unbeatable. The farce of invincibility dissipated under the blizzard, and the truth became evident. Napoleon's army was not being defeated by military force, but by nature itself and the collapse of its morale. And as the days dragged on and the army shattered further, the retreat became for many a race with no destination, a path of no return. The army, which had once represented a formidable power, was now a shadow of itself. And instead of conquering Russia, Napoleon and his men were now just trying to escape the relentless winter that consumed them. It's easy to look at historical records and see Napoleon as the great strategist, the leader who wielded military power with astonishing precision. However, his invasion of Russia, one of the most iconic campaigns of his career, was ultimately an illusion of power, an invasion that was never really an achievement. This, in fact, is what disturbs us most when we reflect on history. The collapse was not a planned defeat, but an unforeseen confrontation with the brutality of nature. When Napoleon launched his army into Russia, he had a vision of glory, of victory, of expansion. He believed that the Russian army would be no match for the overwhelming strength of his troops, that the snow would be only a temporary obstacle, and that victory would only be a matter of time. And he was aware that for an empire like his, control over Russia would mean a colossal victory, one that would solidify his leadership throughout Europe. However, the reality was completely different. Napoleon's battlefields, great victories, and even the most tangible goals were lost in a storm of cold and disease. What seemed like a well-planned invasion became a fatal trek into the frozen wasteland of Russia, where Napoleon's army faced death not only at the hands of the Russians, but in the relentless grip of winter. And this was a tragic irony. Napoleon's army, which had fought and conquered so much, was not defeated by a visible enemy, but by the simple fact of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, in conditions that he and his generals could not foresee. We could romanticize history, as we often do with great leaders and great campaigns, and talk about the spirit of Napoleon that supposedly remained unshaken until the end. But the fact is that this story is not glamorous. There is no honor in the defeat of Napoleon's army by nature. There is no glory in senseless deaths caused by cold and sickness. What we have is the stark reality. Napoleon underestimated the power of the Russian winter, and this resulted in a devastating loss. More than 600,000 men who, when they launched themselves into what they thought was a glorious invasion, met death in a land that did not forgive. In some ways, the collapse of Napoleon's army is a reminder that nature, with all its force and unpredictability, can defeat even the most powerful men. The sense of invincibility that Napoleon had cultivated throughout his career was tragically dismantled, not by military failures, but by an unforeseen enemy, impossible to fight with tactics or ambition, the Russian winter. And although he survived the campaign, Napoleon's empire never fully recovered from that defeat. It was a fatal blow to his confidence and perhaps also to his view of the world. In the end, the story of the Russian invasion is a bitter lesson in how much nature can annihilate even the grandest human achievements. The force of arms can be powerful, but not everything can be controlled or defeated. After Moscow's desperate retreat, Napoleon's great ambitions seemed to have come to an end. The invasion, which initially seemed destined for glory, became the epitaph of an empire that, until then, seemed invincible. What remained now were the ruins of an imperial dream that had unraveled under the weight of snow and suffering. Russia, with its cold and hostile vastness, was not only a military enemy, but a natural force that dismantled Napoleon's war machine, revealing the fragility of human power in the face of nature. You can imagine Napoleon's shock at seeing the collapse of the army. A man who had risen to power so quickly and strongly, conquering empires and forging a reputation as a military genius, now found himself facing what seemed like an unswallowable defeat. Napoleon still believed, with his characteristic obstinacy, that he could recover the situation, that the empire could be restored. But as much as he tried to maintain his image as a great strategist, the truth was that the Russian invasion could not be seen as a battle lost only by military mistakes. It was a bitter lesson that in some cases, human strength cannot compete with the whims of nature. Imagine yourself in Napoleon's shoes. The grandeur of his empire was disintegrating, his troops devastated, and the dream of a vast empire in Europe was rapidly unraveling. There were no more glorious victories, only a disorderly retreat, an army that could no longer hold together. How to maintain the morale of an empire that now faced not only a defeat, but the imminent end of everything Napoleon had built. How to convince a people who hailed him as a hero to continue believing in the possibility of an invincible empire when all that remained was failure. Napoleon returned to Paris, but not as the triumphant hero who had departed. His reputation, which was already being challenged by so many defeats, suffered an irreparable blow. He, who had become a living legend, was now a man facing the harsh reality of failure. And as with any great fall, His perception of power has unraveled, showing the world that not even the greatest empires and the most powerful men are free from forces that cannot be controlled. But perhaps the greatest legacy of the disastrous Russian invasion is the learning that Napoleon's empire was not defeated by battle or betrayal, but by ruthless nature. His arrogance, his belief that victory was guaranteed due to the size of his army and the strength of his strategy, was torn apart by Russian frosts. He, the great strategist, had not calculated the true strength of his enemy, winter. This failure to understand nature not only put an end to his Russian campaign, but also marked the beginning of the fall of the empire itself. History, therefore, not only reveals Napoleon's failure in Russia, but also shows us how even the greatest men and the greatest empires are, in the end, vulnerable to forces that cannot be foreseen or countered. The silent cry of the victims, the invisible suffering of the soldiers. Napoleon's defeat in Russia cannot be understood only in terms of numbers or military victories and losses. The suffering his men faced is often ignored in historical narratives. Stories of epic battles and dazzling victories often obscure the silent pain and suffering of soldiers, who died not with guns drawn, but from cold, hunger, and terrible diseases that swept through the ranks of the army. Imagine what it was like for soldiers to march for days on end in a climate that seemed to want to devour their souls. The biting cold was relentless, piercing through the torn uniforms, entering his bones, and freezing even his thoughts. Hunger dragged on like a shadow, further weakening the physical and mental resistance of men. Many of their stomachs were empty, but instead of food, what was consumed were thoughts of despair. There wasn't much to do but keep going, even when the body couldn't take it anymore. Diseases, equally devastating, decimated the troops. It was not only the cold that haunted the men, but the fever, the dysentery, the infections. The very act of trying to tend to one's wounds became a death sentence, as there were no resources, no medicines, no proper care. Many soldiers simply fell along the road, unable to continue, and were left behind, forgotten, their fate sealed by the unforgiving conditions of the land on which they marched. If you could see those men, exhausted and aching, no longer seeking glory or victory but just trying to survive, perhaps the grandeur of Napoleon's story would lose some of its luster. The struggle was no longer between large armies, but between an army and the invisible forces that threatened to devour their lives one by one. And the pain was not only physical, but also emotional. The despair of knowing that no matter how hard they fought, many would not survive. They were losing the battle against something bigger than themselves: nature, hunger, and fate. What is lost in great victories is often the face of the anonymous soldier, the one who does not go down in history but who carried on his back the weight of the march, the horrors of war, and, in the end, silent death. These stories are harder to tell, because there is nothing grand about a soldier falling frozen in the snow, without another breath, without another word of resistance. He will not be remembered as a hero, but as a cold statistic. Perhaps the real tragedy of the Russian campaign is not only the loss of life, but the immeasurable suffering that often goes unnoticed. After all, Napoleon might be great, but what he didn't understand was that his greatness couldn't protect his men from an enemy that was unseen, but that overwhelmed them with uncontrollable force. The invisible suffering of Russian and French soldiers, consumed by cold and hunger, is perhaps the most real legacy of this failed invasion. The retreat from Moscow was undoubtedly one of the most chaotic and desolate situations for Napoleon's army. At first, he still tried to control the situation, but reality soon showed that the chaos could not be tamed, not even by a commander of his ability. The Russian winter was beyond any strategy, and what was unfolding was not an organized retreat but a slow and painful collapse. What happened to Napoleon's leadership during these critical moments? Was he there? Or did you simply become another victim of circumstances? In fact, Napoleon was not immune to the emotional destruction that befell his men. As a leader, he tried to maintain morale, moving from one camp to another, still trying to convince his commanders and soldiers that victory was possible. But there was a crucial difference between the battles of glory and that inevitable collapse. Winter could not be fought with a simple military order. No matter how much he tried to rationalize, the reality was that nature was wiping out his army with a force that no general, no matter how brilliant, could control. Imagine yourself as one of the soldiers during those days. The initial hope of conquering Russia has been shattered, giving way to despair and frustration. The battlefield, previously so organized, has turned into vast chaos. Desperate, hungry, and frozen soldiers abandoned their weapons and walked away from the troops. Many succumbed to the cold, to attacks by Russian warriors in constant pursuit, or to simple exhaustion. Napoleon's orders to continue the march were repeated, but the reality on the front line was one of a total collapse. The failure of Napoleon's leadership was not so much a lack of courage or strategic skill as a failure to adapt to that unique and extreme circumstance. As Napoleon continued to command, a sense of helplessness hung in the air, and the inability to resolve what was happening quickly spread among the troops. Leadership is important, but in a context where the environment and natural elements become the real enemy, even the best leaders can lose control. The men under his command were more concerned with surviving the deadly cold than with following orders that by this point seemed irrelevant. And most tragic of all, no matter how hard Napoleon tried to maintain control and dignity of the situation, many of his soldiers never even saw the direct effects of his leadership in this chaos. Command messages arrived sparsely, often ignored as the army fell apart. The orders were becoming empty, and the soldiers found themselves alone in the face of an icy and menacing expanse. They were not fighting for glory or for a grandiose empire. They were fighting only for survival, and in survival Napoleon's leadership no longer mattered. What remained of this withdrawal was a bitter reflection of what happens when a leader's ambition bumps into the implacable limits of nature. There was no more victory to be achieved. The withdrawal became an impulsive movement, an escape from a nightmare from which one could not awaken. In the end, the real defeat was not at the hands of the Russians, but in Napoleon's inability to face an enemy that could not be defeated with military tactics: winter. And this, more than any defeat in battle, was the fatal blow that dismantled Napoleon's empire. As Napoleon's army withdrew from Russia, the horrors of the march intensified. If the invasion was already a nightmare, the retreat was even worse. The Russian winter, which seemed unbeatable, showed no signs of mercy. Every step the soldiers took was a fight against death, which was approaching unhurriedly, but with certainty. The suffering increased as the men walked through miles of snow and ice, and the hope of escaping Russia began to dissolve. With each hour, despair spread, and the line between survival and death became increasingly blurred. Imagine yourself in the place of these men, a figure lost in a mass of disoriented and exhausted soldiers. The cold was so piercing that the toes froze. The feet became sensitive to the touch of the icy ground, and the only sound was that of the wind cutting through the skin, and the sound of tired footsteps in the snow. Food was scarce, and those who could hunt or forage for something to eat were more focused on staying alive than on any kind of military resistance. The war had been left behind, and now it was just an army trying to achieve survival, a race against time and against a relentless winter. Some still tried to maintain order, but the discipline of an already weakened army was disintegrating with each step taken. The soldiers were so weakened that many began to abandon what was left of their training. And the worst, the maximum commander, Napoleon, although he was still present, seemed more and more distant, a figure powerless in the face of what was happening. There were no more brilliant strategies, only the desperate desire to get out of a deadly trap. His generals, once proud of their position, now shared the same anguish, unable to do anything to reverse the disaster. But the most distressing thing was not only the cold or the diseases. The greatest suffering was in the minds of men, in the psychological wear and tear of knowing that the end was near, that the chances of survival decreased by the minute. Even those who managed to resist cold, hunger, and thirst faced a psychological death when they realized they were in a battle they could not win. There was a sense of inevitability, a feeling that they would not make it out of Russia alive. They were fighting not to win, but to avoid the painful end that seemed to be approaching at every turn. The retreat was, in fact, a march to the abyss. There were no more moments of glory, no more victories to be celebrated. Each step taken by the soldiers represented the growing distance between them and any possibility of redemption. Napoleon himself, so accustomed to commanding with authority and security, no longer had answers for what was happening. He tried to maintain order, but in a sea of hopelessness it seemed to be as useless as trying to put out a fire with a glass of water. In fact, the real battle was no longer a war against a visible enemy, but a struggle for human survival. What had begun as an attempt to expand his empire became a race against an unseen enemy, the cruel winter, which left nothing but fallen bodies and the echo of silenced voices in the icy expanse. That last march was not about military strategy. but about endurance and pure endurance, to the last man, to the last breath. When Napoleon finally arrived back in France, the grandeur of his image as a conquering leader was irreparably shattered. The great emperor who had once ruled with an iron fist over almost all of Europe was now a man marked by failure, returning with what was left of a devastated army. What is left of his great invasion? A fraction of the original army, malnourished, morale shattered, and laden with pain, hunger, and disease. Instead of glory, what Napoleon brought with him was the weight of defeat, a burden difficult to carry. But what shocked France most was not just the return of a defeated man. It was the contrast between the departed Napoleon and the one who had returned. When he embarked on the Russian campaign, he was a determined leader, a figure who inspired both confidence and fear. His army was vast, with hundreds of thousands of men ready to conquer. But the man who came back was very different. Trust had been replaced by visible uncertainty, the look of a commander who knew he had failed, not only in one battle, but in the whole idea of an invincible empire. Napoleon tried to keep his composure, trying to regain control, but he knew something was irretrievably lost. The shadow of defeat hung over him, and the doubt in his heart could no longer be ignored. For the French people, Napoleon's return came as a shock. He was now a man who had failed in the face of the greatest enemy of all, winter, nature, something against which even the greatest military strategy was powerless. For many, Napoleon's return was not a cause for celebration, but for anguish. They saw the decay of an imperial dream that had once seemed infinite. The man who had built the French Empire now returned, not with the strength of an unbeatable ruler, but as an exile, with his face scarred by defeat. What he had so hard earned was shattered by the cruelty of the Russian winter. Imagine for a moment the feeling of returning to Paris after such a humiliating defeat. The city that once revered the great Napoleon would now be marked by a comeback of failure. The eyes of his countrymen would no longer be of adoration, but of doubt. The empire that Napoleon had cultivated so much was no longer there, and he could no longer fool anyone with his past victories. He carried with him the memory of a brutal winter that had ripped away everything from his armies to his very identity. Napoleon's return to France was not just a physical change, but a psychological transformation. The man who had left with dreams of grandeur was now faced with the harsh reality of failure. For the soldiers who had survived Russia, the return to the homeland was not a triumphant return, but a return to a country that perhaps no longer saw them as heroes. Napoleon might have brought the army back, but honor and glory were frozen on Russian soil, lost in the vast, unforgiving tundra. What he found upon his return was an empire that was already beginning to question its worth, and more importantly, an emperor who was also beginning to question himself. Now, all that remained were the scars of a lost war, the weight of a defeat that could not be disguised. Napoleon's imperial dream was irretrievably shattered, and as much as he tried to maintain the facade of invincibility, the truth was clear. Nature had defeated not only his armies, but the very concept of his greatness. Back in France, the question that echoed in the streets was no longer, "When will we conquer the world again?" but "What would the empire be like now without him?" After the disastrous Russian campaign, Napoleon saw his rise to glory diminish with each step he took into exile. The great conqueror, who had once dominated almost all of Europe, was now destined for the solitude of a remote island. The island of Elba, a destination more suitable for a defeated man, a former emperor, than for someone who once seemed unstoppable. The return to Paris, if it was glorious for Napoleon, quickly dissipated, and he saw his downfall come to fruition when he was forced to abdicate once more, being exiled, this time away from the lands he had ruled so fervently. On the island of Elba, Napoleon lived out his final days in a confinement that seemed to be a fitting punishment for someone who had been such an absolute authority figure. Imagine the shock of a person who went from commander of powerful armies to a prisoner on a tiny island, with nothing to govern but himself and a limited territory, far from the brilliance and grandeur he once possessed. There were no more legions of soldiers to march in his honor. There were no more milestones and victories to celebrate. Just a lonely man on an island, not knowing what to do with the rest of his days. Napoleon's loneliness in exile was a shadow that accompanied him everywhere. Without the glory of the battlefields or the dignity of the emperor, he lived in a prison of gold, if one can call it that. Elba was not only a physical prison but also a mental one. Every day he found himself more distant from the grandeur of his bygone days, more isolated from a world that now seemed to no longer care about him. His dreams of reconquest, of regaining power and supremacy, were nothing more than memories, fragments of a distant time. Although he still had a following, Napoleon was no longer in control. His allies were few, and his power, which had once seemed limitless, now boiled down to an island and a title that meant little. In his last days on Elba, the man who had ruled vast territories seemed to wither in the face of abandonment and purposelessness. He spent his days trying to find something that resembled the greatness of the past, but what he found was only emptiness. There were no more epic battles to be fought. There was no longer an empire to be expanded. Napoleon's solitude on Elba was, in many ways, a cruel metaphor for the end of his empire. The man who once conquered the world was now confined to an insignificant piece of land, far from all that he once represented. What was left for him was only a specter of his own glory, a shadow that tormented him as he contemplated the choices that had led him there. No longer surrounded by generals and strategists, but surrounded only by the vastness of the ocean and the memory of a lost empire. The story of Napoleon on Elba is that of a man defeated but still fighting, still seeking to regain a piece of what he lost. The pain of loss, the fall of the empire, and impotence in the face of a future without glory was the final price of unbridled ambition. The island of Elba then became not only a place of exile, but the scene of a last gasp of an empire that no longer existed, an empire that had succumbed to forces that Napoleon could not control: the cold, the winter, and the unforgiving nature of war. Napoleon's story could have ended quietly, with him disappearing into the obscurity of his exile on the island of Elba. But the ambition that had defined him all his life could not be extinguished so easily. In 1815, just a few months after being exiled to Elba, Napoleon did the unthinkable. He escaped. The man who had been defeated by the Russian winter and the fall of his empire was not ready to be erased from the pages of history. He fled Elba, gathered some loyal followers, and began what became known as the 100 Days, a final attempt to regain lost power. Imagine for a moment the scenario. The man everyone believed to be finished, exiled and seemingly powerless, reappears as a ghost from the past. He returns to France, and in a surprising twist, many of the former soldiers and officers who had served in his empire welcome him with open arms. The figure of Napoleon still possessed a powerful aura. In his mind, he still believed himself to be the savior of the nation, the man destined to restore France to greatness. His arrival in Paris was received as an unexpected event, a last attempt to reverse the inevitable. But there was something tragic about Napoleon's attempt. He knew deep down that this return was yet another last fight against what he couldn't accept: his downfall. For him, there was no other option but to fight. And contrary to what many may have imagined, Napoleon wasn't just trying to restore his own glory. He believed that his return could bring stability to France, which, after his fall, was mired in political instability. However, this return would only be a prelude to another defeat. The 100 days did not last long. Although Napoleon managed to muster a considerable number of men, popular support was not enough to ensure his stay in power. He no longer had the strength he had before, and Europe was much more cautious this time. The European powers, with their renewed alliances, were unwilling to allow Napoleon to regain control. And so Napoleon's return led to the last battle of his life, the famous Battle of Waterloo. But before we get to Waterloo, it's interesting to reflect on what motivated Napoleon to embark on this latest adventure. He was, deep down, fighting a fate that already seemed sealed. He still believed that he could be the hero of his own story, that he could alter the narrative that had been written for him. The return to Paris was not just a physical return, but a psychological struggle, a last-ditch effort by a man who could not understand the inevitability of his fall. Napoleon's attempt to regain control of France was in many ways a reflection of his internal struggle against failure and defeat. He refused to accept that the empire he had built and destroyed could not be restored. The man who had commanded epic battles and conquered vast territories now faced something he could not conquer: time, history, and the reality of his own defeat. The Battle of Waterloo, fought on June 18, 1815, marked the culmination of Napoleon's attempt to return to power and re-establish his empire. Napoleon's last chance, the 100 Days, had been reduced to a single decisive battle. The name Waterloo would soon become synonymous with total defeat, and it's not hard to see why. Napoleon, despite being a brilliant strategist and a renowned commander, no longer had the resources, the army, or the support to sustain his ambitions. He was facing a coalition of European forces far more prepared and determined not to let him return to power. If you put yourself in Napoleon's shoes that day, you'll see that there was more than just the cold of the battlefield. He was fighting the inevitable. The weight of his past failures and the echo of the Russian winter were with him in every command, in every strategic move. But the hardest thing for him was to deal with the truth that his greatness was no longer relevant. It didn't matter how brilliant he was as a strategist or how well he could command his armies. The world had changed, and he no longer had the ability to shape it the way he wanted. Napoleon was no longer fighting an invisible enemy, as in the Russian winter. He was facing a tangible and immense enemy, a coalition made up of armies from powers such as Britain, the Low Countries, Prussia, and many others. And most of all, he was fighting against time. Napoleon's empire was no longer the same. The armies were not the same. The allies were not the same. And the world had reorganized itself without him. But the Battle of Waterloo was not just a military defeat. It was a defeat in every way. In many ways, it was the ultimate recognition that the man who had unified France, conquered much of Europe, and been the leader of an unparalleled empire was no longer capable of ruling. Napoleon was faced with his own political mortality. The forces that were aligned against him were strong, ruthless, and more than enough to ensure that he never returned to power. Throughout the battle, Napoleon tried to use his usual tactics, but a lack of supplies, the fatigue of his army, and the immense strength of his enemies rendered his efforts futile. His confidence, which had been one of his greatest virtues, was now his greatest weakness. He was isolated without support, and lacking the skills that had previously allowed him to turn the tables in his direction. The sound of guns, the noise of horses, and the smell of gunpowder filled the field. But for Napoleon, what echoed most were the memories of those icy lands of Russia, of his army destroyed by hunger, disease, and cold. Everything he tried to do now seemed useless. Ultimately, the defeat at Waterloo was not only a military defeat, but also a personal defeat. Napoleon was captured and exiled again, this time to the island of St. Helena, where he would live out the rest of his days in even deeper isolation. The cruel irony of his journey was that he, who had been so great and invincible, ended up relegated to a life of exile, far from the world he had tried to dominate. If you think about how Napoleon's story ended, it will not be with the image of a great emperor, but with that of a defeated man stranded on a distant island far from everything he had conquered. The Battle of Waterloo was not only the last battle of his life, but also the end of an era. The era of Napoleon was over, and the world was ready to move on without him. After the crushing defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon was taken to St. Helena Island, a small piece of land in the South Atlantic, where he would spend his final years, isolated and far from everything he had ever known. St. Helena was the definitive exile, a remote and inaccessible place, chosen because it was practically impossible to escape. For Napoleon, the island of St. Helena represented not only the end of his empire, but the end of a life of conquests, strategies, and battles. Now he was far from his greatness, forced to confront a fate he couldn't change. Imagine the scenery, a desolate island, surrounded by the immense ocean, with a constant climate of mist and wind. St. Helena was the opposite of anything Napoleon had known. There were no grand palaces, no loyal advisors, no battles to be fought. Just the sound of the wind hitting the cliffs and the feeling of being at the mercy of nature, out of control. Napoleon, the man who ruled vast territories, was now trapped in a place of relative insignificance. Napoleon's days on St. Helena were dull and lonely. He moved around the island, with his small band of followers, trying to maintain a certain dignity, but increasingly worn out, both physically and psychologically. The doctors who accompanied him recorded his steadily deteriorating health, and he, a man who had once been synonymous with vigor and strength, now spent his days trying to find purpose in such a distant and silent place. He still dreamed of a return to power, but that no longer seemed possible. The world had already moved on without him. For many, St. Helena became a symbol of Napoleon's ultimate downfall. The great emperor was now at the mercy of his own inner demons, reflecting on his journey, his victories, and his defeats. Instead of being in Paris, or in some sumptuous palace, he was on a deserted island where silence was more deafening than any battle. His life, which had been marked by moments of incredible glory and triumph, was now reduced to conversations with his few followers and memories of a lost era. The isolation was cruel to Napoleon, even though he still tried to maintain some sort of influence over what was left of his small circle. The truth was that he was stuck with his own history, unable to escape the weight of his fall. The hours dragged on, and the only thing that kept him alive was the echo of memories of his greatness. Afternoons on the island were long and lonely, often spending hours in its gardens or in a small study, where he tried to write his memoirs. But what did he really want to write? He tried to find a meaning for his life, for his fall, but every day it seemed clearer that he no longer had anything great to leave to the world. St. Helena was not just a physical exile, but an emotional and psychological exile. Napoleon was now confronting the greatest defeat of all, defeat against time and fate. He had built an empire that seemed eternal, but the nature of time had shown that even the most powerful are subject to forces beyond their control. The island became his prison, but also a mirror of the reality he had to face. His rise and fall, his choices, and the consequences he now had to accept. Napoleon's final exile was the end of a cycle. From emperor to prisoner, from conqueror to defeated man, he spent his last days on St. Helena, far from the great battles, far from the great decisions. His empire was lost forever, and he had become a figure of the past, a distant memory of the glories and tragedies that had marked his life. The island was not just a physical place, but a symbolic place of all that he had lost. Napoleon Bonaparte died on May 5, 1821, on the island of St. Helena, after a long battle with illness and suffering. He was 51 years old, but looked much older due to the deterioration of his health, marked by a combination of factors, including loneliness, lack of proper medical care, and possibly the stress accumulated over the years of conflict and exile. His death was not a great epic battle, but a silent and painful end, something that contrasted deeply with the life full of action, intrigue, and grandeur he had lived. The final diagnosis of his death was officially given as stomach cancer, although some historians believe he may have been poisoned, a rumor that circulated during and after his death, due to the suspicious appearance of some of his ailments and the fact that he was frequently exposed to toxic chemicals during his imprisonment. But the reality is that, more than any poison, what really killed Napoleon was the weight of his own history, the consequence of the choices he made throughout his life. The man who once had the world at his feet was now facing the consequences of his fall. Throughout his last days, Napoleon demonstrated a bitter and reflective character. Although he was a brilliant emperor, a man whose vision of power and ambition knew no bounds, he died in a place that represented all that he had lost. Instead of being surrounded by a court and counselors, he was surrounded by a handful of officials and doctors who, though loyal, could not heal the physical and emotional pain he carried. He who had been the commander of a great nation and mighty armies was now in a bed, waiting for the end to come, with the hope of an impossible return. Napoleon did not spend his last moments in peace. The constant isolation and difficult life on St. Helena, combined with the weight of defeat, made his last years a real martyrdom. Many of his followers were far away, and those who remained by his side seemed more like shadows of a lost empire. His once unbeatable spirit now seemed broken, and he spent his days looking back, trying to understand where things had gone wrong. The story he had tried to write for himself was coming to an end, and what remained were only memories of an era that no longer existed. Napoleon's death was accompanied by a small ceremony. His body, already weakened by illness, was placed in a simple coffin, and the few present accompanied him to his grave. The great emperor, whose victories had been celebrated in palaces and battlefields, was now buried in a remote land, far from the glory and power he once had. Napoleon's death was ultimately the closing of a cycle. His life, which had been marked by ambition and achievement, now ended in a modest end, far from the great cities he had once ruled. Interestingly, Napoleon, who throughout his life was obsessed with the legacy he would leave, ended up becoming a historical figure who would continue to fascinate generations. His death on St. Helena was not the end of his story, but only the beginning of a new phase. where he would be remembered as both a hero and a tyrant. His figure, immortalized by historians and politicians, would become a symbol of power and fall, of rise and decay, a bitter lesson that even the greatest empires can unravel over time. In reflecting on Napoleon's death, we can consider what is left of him. He is gone, but his story, full of brightness and darkness, still echoes in our days. Even in death, Napoleon remained a shadow of himself, a reminder of how the unbridled pursuit of power can be both grand and tragic. After his death, Napoleon Bonaparte's name did not disappear into the mists of time. Instead, he turned into a legend, a figure who would be interpreted in 1,000 ways over the decades. Napoleon was not just an emperor, a conqueror, a military man. He became a symbol, both of absolute power and of his irremediable downfall. But what did he really leave as a legacy? What really remained of the man who had been the center of the Western world for nearly 2 decades? In terms of military achievements, Napoleon's legacy is undeniable. He altered the course of history with his strategies, his war tactics, his ability to maneuver armies, often winning impossible battles. His ability to turn defeat into victory was almost mythical. He was not only a general but a master of battle, able to take advantage of any situation, any terrain, any moment of weakness of the enemy, and turn the tide of war in his favor. But at the same time, it is impossible to look at Napoleon's legacy without considering the dark side of his ambition. Despite their victories, the truth is that behind the glow of military glory was an unstable empire. Napoleon's policies, while innovative, were often based on absolute control, on tyranny disguised as governance. He wanted to control everything, even people's hearts and minds. The Code Napoleon, Napoleonic Code, which he implemented in much of occupied Europe, is still a basis for modern legal systems. But centralized rule and the aggressive expansion he imposed on conquered nations left deep scars, and a resentment that would survive long after his death. Napoleon's greatest legacy, perhaps, is not the grandeur of his empire or the organization of his army, but rather the model of leadership and power he represented. His name has become synonymous with unbridled ambition, a constant pursuit of greatness, and inevitably, his downfall. He was a man who believed he could shape the world according to his vision, but in the end, he found himself crushed by the very forces he had unleashed. Its rise and fall offer a merciless lesson in the dangers of overconfidence and lack of boundaries. And of course, we cannot forget the cultural and symbolic impact that Napoleon left on the world. His image, always surrounded by controversy, permeates the collective imagination. In many countries, he is viewed with a combination of respect and condemnation. In France, he is a hero, a symbol of national greatness and the order he brought after the French Revolution, but also a tyrant who subjugated other peoples and wreaked havoc in his quest for power. In other parts of Europe, he is remembered as a ruthless conqueror whose ambition led to the deaths of millions. But in the end, what Napoleon really bequeathed to the world was more than just lands and battles conquered. He left an indelible mark on human history, showing the world the limits of absolute power and the fragility of even the most powerful empires. His story is not only that of a man who tried to conquer the world, but also that of a man who, in the process, was consumed by his own ambition. What remains of Napoleon is a complex and multifaceted legend, which continues to be studied, discussed, and reinterpreted over time. His life and legacy, full of sparkles and shadows, remind us of the ephemeral nature of power and how great victories can eventually become just one part of a larger story. A story about the rise, fall, and search for meaning in a world that is always in motion. When Napoleon Bonaparte was finally defeated and exiled to the island of St. Helena, the empire he had so painstakingly built quickly collapsed. The allies who had united to defeat him were not only interested in defeating him, they were determined to erase the vestiges of his era of conquest and dominance. Thus, the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1814 and again in 1815 after the 100 Days of Napoleon, was the milestone that ended the Napoleonic Empire. But what did this treaty represent for the countries involved? And how did the world react to this collapse? Firstly, the Treaty of Paris of 1814 placed France in a state of humiliation and fragility. The nation, which had once been the center of power and influence in Europe under Napoleon, saw its territory reduced and its influence weakened. The treaty restored the French borders to the limits of 1792, before the rise of Napoleon, and the monarchy was restored under Louis XVI, brother, Louis XVIII. Napoleon's fall was not just the fall of one man, but the end of an era of revolutionary transformations and imperialist ambitions that marked France and Europe. However, the Treaty of Paris did not only mean a rotation of power, but also an attempt to re-establish a more traditional order in Europe. The victorious powers, such as Great Britain, Prussia, Russia, and Austria, sought to ensure that nothing resembling Napoleon's empire would ever re-emerge. It was the birth of the Congress of Vienna, where the great powers met to redraw the political map of Europe, restoring monarchies and creating a new order that sought to balance power between nations and prevent future wars of conquest. However, the Treaty of Paris and the changes it brought failed to completely eliminate Napoleon's legacy. Many of the revolutionary ideals he had promoted during his reign, equality, liberty, and fraternity, remained alive, despite attempts to neutralize them. The idea of an empire ruled by the willpower of a single leader was defeated, but not the idea that the people could be driven to rise up against traditional power structures. Thus, the Treaty of Paris was not a simple return to the status quo, but a failed attempt to extinguish a flame that was still burning in many European hearts. The post-Napoleon era was not, as many had hoped, a smooth return to the old order. While the restoration of monarchies was successful in some places, in others, such as France, revolutionary ideas were still brewing beneath the surface. Even Napoleon's death did not cause the liberal and republican movements to disappear. The Napoleonic Empire had left its mark on the society, politics, and even military structures of European countries. The French army, for example, still carried with it many of Napoleon's tactical innovations, even after his fall. Elsewhere in Europe, the Treaty of Paris and the Congress of Vienna only masked the political and social tensions that would soon explode into revolutions. Napoleonic ideas about nationalism and the importance of the centralized state continued to resonate with future generations. Napoleon himself, who died in 1821, was still a revered figure by many, especially in his native Corsica, where he would continue to be seen as a hero and symbol of resistance against oppressive forces. Napoleon's end was therefore more than a simple military defeat. It was a point of transition for a world that was constantly changing. The Treaty of Paris and the Congress of Vienna attempted to restore a balance, but the impact of the Napoleonic Wars would continue to be felt for decades, and many of the ideals Napoleon had championed, no matter how authoritarian in their implementation, would continue to influence the course of European and world history. The story of Napoleon, his rise and fall, shows us that empires can disappear, monarchies can be restored, and treaties can be signed to ensure peace. But the ideas a man leaves behind, however ephemeral they may seem, can continue to shape the future in unexpected ways. The post-Napoleonic world was not a world free of its shadow. Rather, it was an era in which the ideals and lessons of the French Empire were intertwined with the future of Europe, influencing the revolutions that would follow. Although Napoleon was defeated and exiled, he did not leave without leaving a significant mark on the European continent. What many consider his greatest contribution to history was not his military victories or his administration, but something more subtle, the spread of nationalism. And curiously, nationalism was not something he had explicitly planned for, but paradoxically, it was he who ended up fanning the flames of a sentiment that would eventually topple many of the regimes he had tried to establish. The concept of nationalism, as we understand it today, is based on the idea that a people should govern its own territory, that the nation is a distinct entity with its own identity, culture, and history. Napoleon, in his quest for power, never fully embraced this concept. However, his military campaigns, which often involved the invasion and occupation of other countries, helped to instill in the conquered peoples a strong sense of national identity. During his conquests, he not only reorganized Europe's borders, but also began to build a Napoleonic ideal of a strong, centralized state, which united the people through powerful leadership. Paradoxically, Napoleon's achievements helped solidify the idea that each nation should have the right to exist independently. In many regions of Europe, such as Italy and Germany, where political divisions were deep and fragmented, Napoleon's French occupation contributed to the strengthening of the nationalist movement. Before Napoleon, these nations were divided into small kingdoms and principalities. With the imposition of Napoleonic reforms, ideas of national unity began to spread. France not only spread the ideas of revolution and equality wherever it went, but also planted the seed for a new kind of political identity. Even under Napoleon's tyranny, populations began to see themselves as part of something larger than their own kingdoms or principalities, the nation. For example, in Germany, the impact of the Napoleonic Wars was profound. The nationalist movement that took shape after Napoleon's defeat was largely fueled by resentment against the invading forces. Napoleon's defeat was seen as a victory for a unified nation, and this paved the way for future revolutions and the formation of the German Empire in the late 19th century. Similarly, in Italy, Napoleon unified several regions that were fragmented and divided, and this helped inspire the movement for Italian unification, led by figures such as Giuseppe Garibaldi. But beyond that, Napoleon's rule also forged a spirit of resistance in the occupied nations, particularly in places like Spain, Portugal, and Russia. The French, who saw their cause as one of emancipation and modernization, did not fully understand the animosity of the local populations, who saw the occupation as a form of imperialism and domination. This generated a wave of popular resistance that, albeit belatedly, would help unite different factions under a single ideal: the defense of national independence. This feeling of nationalism would be an important factor in many of the uprisings and revolutions that arose in the 19th century. The phenomenon of Napoleon fueling nationalism is not limited to Europe. Even in the French colonies, where the idea of a nation under one flag was a distant concept, the Napoleonic regime helped strengthen independence movements. In places like Latin America, the struggle against the Napoleonic Empire and its idea of a Europe dominated by a single man created the ground for various colonies to start their own revolutions. However, Napoleon's legacy also brings with it a paradox. Although he unwittingly sown the idea of nationalism, he could not live to see the consequences of this transformation. Nationalism was one of the forces that most challenged the empire he had built, as conquered peoples rose up against domination and sought the right to form their own nations. He had created a European empire, but at the same time helped plant the seeds for the dissolution of that empire. What Napoleon did not fully understand was that, however much he tried to impose a new European order on his command, the spirit of nations and peoples could not be totally subdued. Nationalism, which he helped awaken, would become the force that would finally overthrow the Napoleonic order. And although Napoleon fell, the concept of the nation, as we understand it today, would expand, gaining traction in the following decades, and becoming the basis of many of the movements that would define world politics in the 19th century and beyond. As much as he was defeated, Napoleon helped create a new kind of political identity, and that identity, the idea of nation, of national unity, of self-determination, would continue to influence the course of history long after his death. The Napoleonic Empire may have fallen, but the impact it left on the modern world continues to be felt to this day. Napoleon in many ways anticipated many of the political, social, and military changes that would come to dominate the following centuries. From his rule, new concepts of power, leadership, and governance emerged that transcended his era and were absorbed by several nations around the world. What remains of his figure is, in fact, a multifaceted legacy, both admired and contested, but undeniably present in various aspects of modern life. Napoleon had a profound impact on issues of governance and public administration. His creation of the Napoleonic Code not only shaped the French legal system but also influenced many legal systems around the world. Unlike laws based on traditions and customs, the Napoleonic Code brought the idea of a set of codified and accessible rules, applicable to all citizens in a uniform manner. This concept of equality before the law, although incomplete in its implementation, has served as the basis for many modern legal systems, not only in Europe, but also in countries outside the continent, such as Brazil, Argentina, and Chile. In addition, the administrative structure that Napoleon imposed on his empire also left an indelible mark. He centralized power, creating an efficient bureaucracy system, something that spread to many countries around the world. His idea of a strong government, which controlled and organized all parts of the empire, inspired many leaders throughout the 19th century and beyond. In fact, the very idea of a centralized, strong government that Napoleon implemented can be seen as a precursor to the modern nation-states that would emerge in the 20th century. Even more impressive was the transformation of the armed forces under Napoleon. He not only organized armies with almost surgical precision, but also renewed military tactics, creating new forms of battle and mobilization strategies. His army became an unbeatable machine, and his war tactics influenced armies around the world. Many of Napoleon's strategies, such as the use of mobile divisions and flexibility in maneuvers, are taught in military academies to this day. The concept of total war, where not only the army but also the entire society is mobilized for the war effort, had its roots in the Napoleonic period. In addition, Napoleon was also a precursor to the idea of a modern secular state. He attempted to reform the Catholic Church in France, taking away much of the political power it wielded, while at the same time recognizing the importance of religion in the social and cultural life of the French people. The separation of church and state, which would later become a central tenet in modern democracies, was something that Napoleon, even in an authoritarian way, began to implement. However, Napoleon's legacy is not without criticism either. Their desire for absolute control and their tendency to use force to impose their ideas created a highly centralized system of government, which at times was more of a tyranny disguised as modernization. His relentless quest for power, through war and conquest, brought enormous suffering to millions of people. The invasion of countries and the imposition of reforms, often without the consent of local populations, generated resistance that would later turn into popular uprisings and nationalist movements, as previously discussed. Still, the figure of Napoleon continues to be venerated by many, who see him as a hero, a revolutionary, a military genius. His image is romanticized by some cultures, especially in France, where he is a symbol of greatness and national power. On the other hand, he is seen as a tyrant and conqueror in many other parts of Europe, where his wartime campaigns have left a trail of destruction and suffering. In this day and age, we can see traces of Napoleon in many of the systems of government and organizations that surround us. The centralization of power, the reform of the law, military structures and war strategies, and even the use of propaganda to strengthen the image of the leader. All these elements are legacies that have their roots in Napoleon. Its impact is not limited to the past alone, but projects itself in complex ways into the present, shaping many of the forms of leadership, power, and control that we see in many nations today. In a way, Napoleon represented the fusion of human greatness and tragedy. It is to this day a fascinating study of how power can be built and destroyed, and how no matter how hard we try to escape our limitations, they end up shaping our actions irreversibly. His legacy, whether seen as a lesson in the dangers of ambition or as a story of overcoming, remains a key to understanding the complexity of modern politics and international relations. Now that Napoleon's empire has been left behind, it's fascinating to reflect on what it represents to us today. Its rise and fall, war and peace, power and loss, all of this continues to resonate in our understanding of leadership, ambition, and even human nature. When we look back, it is easy to fall into the temptation to see Napoleon as an almost mythical being, as a character in epic stories, someone who dared to go beyond the imaginable, to the limits of destruction and absolute power. But when we think of Napoleon today, we can draw some fundamental lessons that go beyond his historical image. First and foremost, Napoleon is an unsettling reminder that the desire for absolute power, no matter how grandiose it may seem, is always bound to collide with human reality. During his meteoric rise, he faced resistance from many, but he also inspired an almost religious loyalty. When he fell, however, the same resistance turned into revolt. The cycle of power he experienced was not only a show of military force, but also a bitter lesson in the limitations of anyone who finds himself at the top of the command pyramid. Today, when we look at leaders and political figures around the world, we can see echoes of what Napoleon experienced. The desire to centralize power, to turn politics into an arena of personal ambition, remains a powerful force. At the same time, the lessons of Napoleon show us that every empire has its days numbered, and that no matter how strong the hand of a ruler, the people always possess a collective force that can dismantle even the most well-established systems. In a modern world of globalization and instant communication, absolute control, as Napoleon tried to exercise, becomes even more difficult to sustain. Another relevant aspect is the reflection on the effects of major wars and large-scale violence, a theme so present in Napoleon's campaigns. Today, Napoleon's power battles may seem distant and unreal, but the impact of his wars was immense. Millions of lives were lost or destroyed by his relentless pursuit of glory. When we think about the current wars, whether in the Middle East or in other regions, we can see how Napoleon's story still reverberates. He, who imagined conquering Europe to consolidate peace and order, ended up creating a cycle of violence that lasted for decades after his fall. War, as always, takes its toll, and Napoleon was one of the most tragic figures to foot that bill, even after his defeat. However, as dark as this legacy is, there is also something very human about the way Napoleon sought to change the world. He was not just a soulless conqueror. He was someone who believed in a better future, even if that future was guided by the strength of his hands. His ideals of reform, of a code of laws, of centralization and modernization, are characteristics of a man who, despite his mistakes, sought to transform the reality of his time. And then there is the question of nationalism, one of Napoleon's most powerful legacies. Napoleon's ideas, though often resisted, also fueled independence movements in various parts of the world. What began as a struggle for empire became a struggle for national identities and self-determination. Today, nationalism continues to be a powerful force, both in its positive and negative aspects, and we must reflect on what it means in a globalized world where borders seem increasingly fluid. Finally, the figure of Napoleon is a portrait of unbridled human ambition and a life that in many ways can seem like a fairy tale, a story of immense glory and devastating fall. However, it is also a story of resistance and survival, as after his defeat, Napoleon continued to be a constant presence in the collective memory of Europeans. The world could not simply erase the impact of his vision and his actions. As we move away from this narrative, we can feel, perhaps, that the story of Napoleon is an invitation to reflect on power, ambition, and humanity. A reminder that the choices we make, the ambitions we pursue, and the systems we build inevitably shape the future. If you wonder as you prepare to leave this history behind and drift off to sleep, what Napoleon taught us, the answer may be simple: that power is fleeting, that great ambitions often come at great costs, and that in the end what matters is how history sees us, not at the height of our glory, but after the fall. Now you're about to fall into a peaceful slumber, where the weight of history dissolves into the soft shadows of the night. May the lessons of Napoleon not haunt you, but help you to rest, free from the shackles of the day.